The Holy Gospel according to St. Mark, the 10th chapter. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What is it you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They replied, "We are able." Then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. You may be seated. Our gospel today follows pretty closely after our gospel last week. So the last 3 weeks we have been in Mark chapter 10. Now we know that the Gospel of Mark moves really fast, so things are always changing. But what we've heard over the last few weeks is Jesus turning trick questions into bigger questions. Things about how we should treat one another, how we should live together. And last week our gospel ended with the last will be first and the first will be last. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus has been teaching his disciples through actions more than words. But the last few weeks, we've been hearing Jesus teaching his disciples using words, answering questions, showing them that there is always more to something than meets the eye. There are only a few verses between last week's gospel and this week's gospel, but those verses are pretty important. The ones that we don't hear, that come immediately before this request from James and John, are Jesus telling his disciples for a third time that they are on their way to Jerusalem and that he will be murdered, he will die, and he will rise again 3 days later. Now we know that the disciples really struggle with this because, one, they don't want to believe that the man that they've been following as the Messiah is going to be killed. And two, even today, if someone told us they were going to rise again 3 days later, we might have a really hard time believing that, wouldn't we? Because how many people do you know have risen from the dead? Right? Only Jesus. It never happened before, and as far as we know, well, there were some miracles that happened before, but Jesus is the one. And I think we'd really struggle with it today if someone came in and said, "Well, I'm going to die, but don't worry, I'm coming back." So the struggling with this teaching of Jesus. Then we come into today's gospel, where James and John pulled Jesus aside. Hey, Jesus, we want you to do something for us. Will you do whatever we ask? Jesus, being wise, says, well, what is it that you want? I'm not just going to say, yes, I'm going to give you whatever you ask. And so what do they ask? Do they ask for healing? Do they ask for wisdom? Nope. They ask for the best seats in the house. Right? Jesus, all we want is this. Put one of us on your left and one of us on your right in your glory. Right? They're imagining Jesus on a throne and the two of them in those wonderful prime positions, helping to boss people around. This is all we want, Jesus. Just put us on your right and left in your glory. It might make us wonder if they were paying attention. Did they not hear the thing that Jesus said about the last being first and the first being last? Did they not hear about the part that Jesus was going to die? So we always hear the story and we wonder, what could they possibly have been thinking? But does Jesus get short with them? Does Jesus lose his temper with them? He doesn't. We don't even see an eye roll from Jesus. I would be rolling my eyes if I were Jesus. And they've been with me for so long and they still aren't getting it. Not even so much as an eye roll or a sigh from Jesus. He says to them, I don't think you know what you're asking. But then he goes on and he says, okay, so I'm going to have some rough times coming. Are you able to do that? Now, do you think that they even spent 1 second thinking about the answer? Nope. Yes, Jesus, we're able. We can do it. So Jesus says, well, okay, so you're going to have some rough times too. But I can't grant you to sit at my left or my right. It's not mine to give. Now, friends, we know what happens. We know what happens when Jesus gets to Jerusalem. So tell me, who ends up on his right and his left? Two thieves, right? We've all seen the pictures of the crosses. Jesus in the middle, and a cross on either side where two thieves are being crucified, one on his left and one on his right. And I think that's what Jesus means when he says, I don't think you know what you're asking. But then, the rest of the disciples, they figure out what James and John have just been asking. And what do they do? What do you think you're doing asking for the best spots in the house? And why didn't we think to ask before you got there? Right? So it says they get angry at James and John. And here's Jesus again. Now all 12 of his disciples are not getting it. And again, he has patience with them. He has patience with them. Because he is always leading by example and by his actions. He is always teaching by the way he interacts with the people around him. He only uses words sometimes. And so he says, okay, look around you. These Romans who are in control, how do their rulers treat them? He says, they lord it over them. The people who are in power lord it over everyone else, take advantage of that power, and do everything only to serve themselves. And he says, that is not our way. That is not our way. Whoever wants to be first among you needs to be a servant. So I've been thinking a lot about this story. And first, I think when we typically hear this story about James and John wanting the best seats in the house, we're kind of judgmental. We say, shh, how could you follow Jesus for so long and not understand that that's not what it's all about? And yet, two things come to me. One is, what if they're asking out of fear? What if they're asking for this out of fear? What if they've heard Jesus say that he is about to be killed? And they've been following him. He's their leader. He's their teacher. What are they going to do if that happens? So what if they are not asking out of pride? What if they're asking out of fear? What's going to happen to us? Please, Jesus, promise us that you will take us with you. And second, I think sometimes we make decisions and ask things out of fear. Anybody here ever asked for something out of fear about what I might miss out on or what might go wrong? And do we use our best judgment when we're asking for things out of fear? Rarely, right? They say it's that early part of our brain that makes us fight or flight, and that's the part of our brain that engages when we're in fear. So save me. I don't care about everyone else. Save me. So maybe we can look at the disciples and see them in a different light. And think about how long we've been following Jesus. And sometimes we'd rather be at the front of the line too, right? Anybody here always want to be at the back of the line? Ruth would always like to be at the back of the line. That's because she doesn't want anyone to see her. And my bet is Becky's got her hand up here, but you can't see her because she's hiding behind the organ. Jesus calls us to servant leadership, which means that we put others first. But there are so few examples of servant leadership in the world, it's hard to see, right? The people who we see on television and in movies more often than not are not servant leaders. They're not putting others first. It's not the way the world works. But one of the things that I love about being here with all of you is that there are so many examples of servant leadership here among you. I told Becky I was going to use her as an example because, Becky doesn't like to be out front. Becky is a wonderful example of servant leadership. Becky won't even stand up for us to recognize her, and yet we know how important it is for her to be here to help lead worship. That is servant leadership. We have a food bank that most of us don't get to see when it's operating, that is led by servant leaders, putting others first. And it's not just the people who are down there in the food bank when the food bank is open, but it's other people who you don't even get to see as they serve. There are people who go get donations from local businesses and local farmers who bring those to the food bank. We never see them. They don't get their names in lights, and yet they do it as a form of servant leadership. When the group went to Autumn Lake Nursing Home over Christmas, and Barb dressed up in her Christmas best with bells and jingles and all of that, most of us didn't get to see that, but the residents received that love from those servant leaders. The residents, who are sometimes really lonely, got to feel the warmth and the love and the care from this congregation, from those servant leaders. There are too many examples here for me to name. I started making a list and decided I can't list every single person here because servant leaders are what you all are about. In fact, I don't think that we really have a James and John here who would be asking for the best seats in the house. Jesus calls us to serve, and you all have responded with such love and humility and joy that I just encourage us to continue to hear Jesus saying, you are called to serve, and you have done well.